Hey everybody, it is June 2020 and it seems like everything in the world is kind of going a little crazy right now, but you have the honor and the privilege of debating at NSDA Nationals in Lincoln, Douglas. So congratulations on that, great job. Online, which is going to be an interesting challenge. On the topic, the intergenerational accumulation of wealth is antithetical to democracy. Just me doing the video, just me editing it, so it may be a little short. I think it will be. I know we're coming in a little late this time, but hopefully you'll have a few days to make use of it before Nationals. As always, the links and the timestamps will be below in the notes. And if it's useful, like, subscribe, maybe tell a friend, and we're on Twitter at Hail State Debate. Quick thoughts on the topic. I love the subject matter. I think accumulation of wealth, wealth inequality generally, we're overdue to talk about it in debate, but I don't love the phrasing. I think antithetical is a really, really tough burden for the AF. It's a very strong word that is an unusual word for a debate resolution. I would have used something a little different. Also, I think linking it specifically to the the impact on democracy narrows what the AF can do a little bit. So I do think it is, ironically, kind of a neg-heavy resolution, but that's okay. We can work our way through that. I will, before we move on to the definitions and framework, offer a few quick tips on NSDA. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but basically, if you've never been to NSDA before, it requires a really good balance of an oratorical, plain-spoken speaking style, but also being really good at sort of the technical aspects of debate. It is easy if you watch NSDA rounds online and compare them to like the TOC or many other forms of LD to think it's mainly about speaking and it's mainly like what they would call dueling oratories. And I don't think that's correct. I think many of the people who win at NSDA are people who are technically very sound debaters, very good at covering the flow, very good at understanding, theory arguments and things like that, but they're able to package it in a way that is accessible to a wide variety of judges because the judging pool at NSDA is drawn from all over. It's not just binary where you have like technical circuit judges and parents who are lay judges who've never seen it before. You have people all across the spectrum of knowledge. You have coaches who've judged a fair amount of debate, it's traditional debate, or they've judged a lot, but mainly they're in individual events, but they're open-minded and things like that. And I would say the vast majority of folks you're going to see at NSDA are going to be open-minded. They're going to be willing to listen to most arguments. They're going to have been trained at minimum on being open-minded and not deciding the round, based on their beliefs, right? I just think you have to make sure that you're explaining your arguments. So if you read a complex piece of evidence, don't just read it, have a short paraphrase where you explain what it means and how it impacts the debate. Give a roadmap, explain where you're going to go, right? Maybe even consider having some oratorical flourishes like an introduction at the beginning of the constructive speech, which you wouldn't do in most places, right? It doesn't hurt to add a little bit of an oratorical style, extemporaneous speaking type style, and then to make sure that the substance is rigorous there as well, right? Take the time to get to know who your judges are if you can, read paradigms if you can. Just like at a regular tournament, at an online tournament, it is totally okay for you at the beginning, the check-in period, to ask judges if there's anything they like to see, and if they tell you that, go with it, right? But a good balance of technical style and oratorical speaking, right, is important. It obviously requires huge amounts of research. We're talking going 14, 15 rounds to get to the finals, hitting a lot of really good people, so it takes work, but I'm sure you're already doing that. Really quick tips on online debating, just a few. Number one, wear the suit. At NSDA, there are going to be a good number of judges who expect to see you just as dressed up as if you were there in person, so go ahead and put on the suit. Some judges won't care, but some will expect it, so there's no reason not to, right? Number two, consider an external microphone, right? Because even though you shouldn't be going too fast at NSDA, your speed should be controlled, like not much faster than I'm going right now, right? Even at the fastest. You really do need to make sure that when you are going a little faster in those final rebuttals, your words are coming through clearly, right? And so you're going to want to have something that's maybe a little bit better than your laptop's built-in mic. Don't go buy one. That would be crazy. You should not have to do that for a debate tournament. But your school or a friend or somebody surely has one that you can borrow if you don't already have it. You can also play around with your setup, right? Because unlike at a regular tournament, you don't have to pack up the laptop and tear it down every single round. So you can get your setup at home or wherever exactly like you want it. Multiple screens, like you can have the Zoom call over here on the laptop and your evidence over here on a desktop monitor. And you can get those cards and everything set up and all the tabs you want exactly like you want it. So spend some time and do that before the tournament. Make sure that you read the guidelines that NSDA has published. They're out there in a PDF about how these rounds are going to work, about checking in before the round. The rounds are double flighted, but everybody is supposed to check in before the first of the 2 double flighted rounds. Make sure you understand how evidence exchanges are going to work, right? Don't be learning that in the first round on the first day of the tournament. And lastly, and maybe most importantly, don't let this be your first online debate ever. Even if you just have to hand a teammate a case and let them just have a round where they just go through the motions and you try it out, do a debate in front of somebody who can look at your face and listen to your voice and give you some feedback on delivery, if nothing else, right, before you go into round 1, right? And I think you'll be in good shape if you do. You're obviously really good debaters because you're there, so that's all you really need to know. So, well, that's not all you need to know, but that's all I need to tell you because you know the rest. So with that, we'll talk a little bit about definitions and a little framework on the debate, some light framework, and then we'll talk about the AF, and then we'll talk about the negative. So looking at definitions and framework, values and criterion for the debate, I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on this because you've probably given a lot of thought to how this is going to work. But I want to say a few things. Definitions are very important on this resolution because we pick some unusual words and we have a resolution that, as I'll talk about later, requires kind of a double jump. Like the AF has to link 2 things. It has to link intergenerational accumulation of wealth probably to wealth accumulation in general, and then wealth accumulation / disparities to some kind of problem with democracy. And because it is kind of a complex resolution, and because it does use this weird word antithetical, definition fights are going to be common. So one thing you need to be ready to do is be ready to have a definition fight in a civil, respectful way in front of a judge who is not used to the idea of people fighting over these things in debate. And so, understanding the debate theory that talks about which definition should you prefer, which definitions are good, which definitions are bad, right? But being able to explain it in a way that is not hyper technical, right? Where you say, you've got 2 definitions, here's why you prefer one, and being ready to do that in the rounds before the tournament starts is going to be, I think, very important because I do believe you will have some skirmishes over this, right? So starting off, intergenerational accumulation of wealth. Obviously, if that were a term of art that was defined like together in the literature, I would tell you to use whatever that collective term means. In my research, I have not found that these specific words in this order are used in the literature particularly. I don't think they're a term of art. I think it's something the NSDA came up with for the resolution, which is totally fine. It's a good phrasing. But what that means is you're going to be defining the words separately because there's no way to really define them together. So what I'll do is I'll talk first about wealth and then move back to intergenerational and then accumulation, okay? So wealth, let's just remember and be clear that wealth is different from income, right? They are not the same thing, although they are correlated, right? Wealth is the amount that you have stacked up over your lifetime or whatever. Income is the amount you have coming in at a particular time, right? So Investopedia has a good definition of wealth as the value of all the assets of worth owned by a person, community, company, or country. Wealth is determined by taking the total market value of all physical and intangible assets owned, then subtracting debts, right? So basically, how much you have stocked up as opposed to how much you're bringing in. This is important because a lot of the data about inequality when it comes to money is actually talking about income inequality. Now, that doesn't make it totally useless. In fact, we're going to talk about a little bit of it because the two are related, right? They're somewhat related, right? But it does mean that when you're looking at the data that you're citing about inequality, you need to try to favor, obviously, wealth inequality and understand the difference between the two and not, be fooled and not be lazy about, scrutinizing it. I'll also say one thing, which is that, the definition of wealth saying person, community, company, or country, there's nothing in the resolution that necessarily says that this has to be the wealth of individuals. So I suppose you could imagine a squirrel case by a debater talking about accumulation of wealth intergenerationally by, say, a corporation or a community. I don't think that's impossible. Intergenerational may imply generations of people, but I wouldn't recommend this. I don't know that there's a major strategic advantage of it. I don't think it is what the framers of the resolution intended, but just be aware that I can envision a squirrel talking about intergenerational accumulation that is not within families, but like a corporation growing in wealth over time or something like that, right? So if you want to look at what what the phrase intergenerational accumulation means, I can't find a specific definition of that, but Gale and Schultz in 1994 have an article about the subject of intergenerational accumulation. It doesn't have like a specific definition that says this is what it means, but if you look at the first paragraph, they have a pretty good explanation, and you can paraphrase it. It says, basically that intergenerational accumulation of wealth is the process by which wealth is acquired by descendants from their ancestors, either through one of two ways, right? So an inter vivos transfer, which is a transfer during the life of the giver. So like if your parents, if you're rich, give you a trust fund, or if they just give you some money, right? That would be inter vivos. Inter vivos just means during life, right? And then there's the bequest. The bequest is when you inherit something. It's, the will gives you $1 million or $1,000 or whatever it is, right? And you inherit it. That would be a bequest, right? So just be aware that those are the two different types of intergenerational accumulation. And then the word accumulation, I don't think is going to be a big point, a sticking point. Webster says that accumulate means to increase gradually in quantity or number. I can't imagine an affirmative maybe trying to use accumulation strategically to argue that like small amounts of wealth transfers are not topical, right? In other words, because accumulation means this needs to be money that stacks up from generation to generation. And like if I give my son $1,000 for graduation, he's going to go out and spend that immediately on like clothes and video games, which, fine, it's a gift, right? It is highly unlikely to ever be passed on to my grandchildren at any point. So the argument would be that that small level of transfer would not be intergenerational accumulation. And this might be important later when we talk about on the negative how the average transfer through an intergenerational transfer of wealth is actually quite low. It's in the $20,000 range, $23,000 range, which is not going to make you a billionaire. It's not going to make you like a wealthy plutocrat. And so the word accumulation might be a way that some affirmatives could try to hit back on that. So just be aware of it. Of course, the big two are antithetical and democracy. Antithetical is defined by Webster as being in direct and unequivocal opposition to, directly opposite or opposed. Now, obviously, this creates a huge burden for the AF. Because while it's pretty easy to show that intergenerational wealth has some effects that might be in tension with a well-functioning democracy, it's pretty hard to argue that they are in unequivocal and direct opposition. The argument would be that the negative would make here is that what this definition basically means is that the two of them can't coexist. Right? You cannot have one and the other. They're like matter and antimatter. You put them together and boom, they just blow each other up. They're incompatible, right? That is a huge burden for the AF if the neg can carry that through. And a word like antithetical really does, in many people's minds, mean diametrically opposed. Not just in tension, not just kind of sort of trade off against each other, maybe not the best fit. It really means they don't go together, right? And the argument would just be you have intergenerational wealth, large amounts of it, in countries that clearly are democracies, therefore I as the negative win. Now that's a facile argument, and later on we're going to talk about how to hit back, but it's an argument that if it's not addressed could be a winner for the negative, no question about it, right? I think the AF's best bet in terms of definitions for antithetical is going to be the Cambridge definition, which is in opposition to each other. Now this is much more reasonable. It just means the two are opposed. They have features that tend to trade off and not, agree, but they don't necessarily have to like antimatter and matter destroy each other. The analogy I would use as the AF is that antithetical just means it's like water is antithetical to fire. It does not mean they cannot coexist in the world. If you dump a little bit of water onto a fire, that doesn't mean the fire goes out entirely necessarily. You can even have fire underwater. You have these blow torches, right, that are used to cut into shipwrecks and things like that. But generally speaking, fire tends to burn and water tends to stop it from burning, right? So there's a general tension. It doesn't mean they're totally incompatible. And I think the AF needs to be ready to sort of, fight on that, right? The negatives preference would be to use the Webster definition of unequivocal opposition or directly opposite and basically argue if I can show you that these can coexist, like there is a democracy that can coexist with it under certain circumstances, then I should win, right? And I think there's some room for like light, what I would call kind of like light theory arguments about like what the criteria should be for using a particular definition in debate, right? Now, I don't think you need to go into any round at NSDA reading like a theory shell or anything like that you would read at a progressive style debate tournament. The interpretation is this, that, and the other. But I do think you need to be able to make lay-friendly judge arguments about why they should pick your definition of antithetical over your opponent's. I think that's very important, right? And if I'm the AF, I'm going to say a couple of things. First First of all, my interpretation of antithetical, if I'm going to say just opposed, is more fair. Because if you go with the negatives definition and just say, can they coexist? Well, I just lose by definition, because I have to concede that there are democracies and they do have some intergenerational wealth in them. That's just a fact. So if we want to have a fair debate where we have any room to debate, we can't use that definition, right? And secondly, my definition is more educational. If we're talking about the tension between the two, that's what the academic literature is actually looking at. It's not asking these silly questions like, can they even be in the same country at the same time? Of course they can. The question is, how much do they trade off against each other? How much does one harm the other, right? And so we'll have a more educational debate. If I'm on the negative and I want to run, a more, sort of formalistic definition of antithetical, I'm going to say, look, the purpose of the intent of the authors, the NSDA could have chosen any word they wanted here. They could have said in tension with, they could have said harms, they could have any number of phrasings, but they chose a strong word, antithetical. And it is not fair to me as the negative if you can lower that burden by basically redefining that word out of the round. We have to be fair. We have to use the word they actually chose, right? So I think we're going to have a lot of fun debates about what antithetical means, which is not ideal, but it is what it is, right? And then lastly, democracy. And I think, again, here the AF has to be very careful. If you're lazy with this definition, it can be a round loser for you. If you go in and say democracy is just a formalistic definition, like government where people vote and the majority rules, well, clearly there are governments where people vote and the majority rules that have, significant wealth inequality. So I think as the AF, you really need to be looking at more of the values of democracy. And so, for example, even Webster has the fifth definition listed under democracy talks about the people being represented in a democracy, right? And you can look to places like the Stanford Encyclopedia page on democracy to talk about the underlying values, better policies, liberty, egalitarianism, things like representativeness, legitimacy, things like that. And you can define democracy, I think, as democratic values, not just the formal act of holding a vote, because we do that in North Korea, right? We have a vote in North Korea. Now it's rigged, right? But many countries that are not particularly democratic hold votes, right? And there's a really good article from Robert Post of Yale back in 2006 that talks about how a democracy is something different than just a majority vote. And for the value of democracy to be upheld, right, you've got to have people feeling that they are represented, right, by the government, that their voice is being heard, and that it is actually carrying out their will, as voters, right? And I think that's a really good definition that you could look to. As a matter of fact, I would suggest that, as I'm going to in a second, that you could use it as a criterion. So with that, let's just jump to, sort of the general framing of the debate, which is, how do we do our values? How do we do our criteria? I'm not going to list a bunch of them because you probably already picked some. I just want to make two observations. The first is, when it comes to values, criteria, and framing, this is a weird resolution in terms of how that will logically work. And let me explain what I mean. When we started using values and criteria as a sort of standard feature in debate, in the Lincoln-Douglas debate 30 years ago, we did so on the assumption that all of our resolutions were going to be propositions of value, right? Like X is good or X is desirable, right? And if you have a proposition of value, then having a value standard and a criterion makes sense, because you've got to have some lodestar to tell the judge what is good, right? Or what is desirable. And that's the function that the value and the criterion have within the case. But not all resolutions are pure questions of value. In fact, I would argue that this resolution really is a question of fact, right? More than a question of value, right? Because it just asks, is A antithetical to B? And you can assign whatever moral value you want to A or B and still answer that question effectively, right? It does not ask you if intergenerational accumulation of wealth is good, and it doesn't ask you if democracy is good or bad, right? It just asks you whether they can fit together or whether they can't, right? Are they antithetical or not, right? That's the factual question. So it's the negative. You could come at this in many different ways. You could argue that democracy is good, but so is intergenerational accumulation of wealth. Or you could argue that democracy is bad, or at least morally neutral, and so is intergenerational accumulation of wealth. Or you could argue that under a certain framework, the morality of it doesn't matter one bit. The two of them can coexist, right? Just factually, right? And the affirmative on the other side would just show that no, they can't go together. But again, it doesn't matter. You don't have to show they're good or moral or just or uphold liberty or uphold any other particular value to talk about their compatibility, right? And so I think this is very much a factual question, right? Now, I'm not telling you to go in and not have a value criterion. You need to do that. But particularly for the app, you have to think about, how do I frame a value and a criterion in a way that is compatible with this being not really exactly a question of value, right? And I think one way to do it as the app is to just make your value democracy. To say, look, the resolution tells us the value. It tells us what we should be looking for, which is, does this square with democracy? So my value will be democracy because that's the question the resolution is asking. Are there other values? Yes, but that's the question the resolution asks. And then you can use this article by Robert Post from 2006 talking about the idea of maybe democratic self-determination for a criterion. Because what he says is basically collective decision-making is democratic as opposed to just being collective because it is experienced as self-determination. When citizens feel alienated from the general will or from the process by which the general will is created, voting is merely a mechanism that can easily turn oppressive and undemocratic. It follows that the value of democracy can be fulfilled only if there is a continual mediation between the collective self-determination and the individual self-determination of particular citizens. If democracy requires that citizens experience their government as their own, as representing them, they must experience the state as in some way responsive to their values and ideas. And you can say that's the standard for determining whether something is really a democracy, which is whether people feel that it legitimately represents them. This is strategic for a couple of reasons. Number one, because I think it answers the factual question. But number two, because it lets you access impacts that you might not be able to otherwise access as the app, which is like opinion polls and perceptions that people have. You can say, look, even if you show that the policies don't change, right, between a nation with accumulated wealth and without intergenerational accumulated wealth, if people feel that a country where plutocrats have a lot of influence, right, the rich people have a lot of influence, is less representative, that feeling itself, right, that lack of legitimacy in and of itself, right, is something that undermines the democracy-ness, I guess, of the government. It becomes less of a true democracy. And you can cite studies, which are abundant, about how people view countries that have major income disparities and view rich people being influential as making their country less democratic. And that in and of itself, independent of practical impacts, is enough arguably to win the round. So anyway, that's just one thought on how we can come at this sort of weird framing of the resolution where it's kind of a question of fact. Hopefully it's useful to you. But at any rate, with that, I think we've done all the framing we can. So we will move on and talk about the affirmative. Okay, so on the app, there's a lot to cover. I want to try to cover it as quickly as I can, so let's get started. First of all, in addition to the specific stuff that you're looking at and drilling down in your own case, you want to make sure that you're reading as broadly as you can so that by the time you start the tournament, right, you have encountered as many ideas as possible. Even if you don't choose to use them in your own case, you want to make sure that ideas, concepts, arguments are not catching you flat-footed, that you've had time to think about them, maybe write a block on them, right? So we're going to link to a couple of surveys of the arguments on the subject of inherited wealth. One of them is, for example, Mark Asher, Curtailing Inherited Wealth from the Michigan Law Review in 1990. Just a good sort of general overview of a lot of the broad arguments about why it's good and bad for democracy, good and bad for society. Wouldn't necessarily build my case around it, but these kinds of articles and surveys are good things to read in your, I'm sure, abundant spare time, just to make sure that nothing is catching you off guard, right? Now, the big sort of framing point about the app is that the app is going to have to proceed more or less in two steps, right? They're going to have to go from intergenerational wealth to presumably wealth disparities overall, and then from wealth disparities overall to harms to democracy. And the reason for that is there's very little evidence out there that talks specifically about the harms to democracy that come from intergenerational wealth. But there's a ton of literature out there that talks about the harms to democracy and harms to society that come from wealth accumulation and wealth disparities in general. So you're going to have to jump from intergenerational wealth transfers and show that those link to overall wealth disparities, and then show that the overall wealth disparities link to whatever your harm is to democracy. This is one of the many reasons why the app is a little bit more challenging side, but you certainly can do it. One strategy would be, you could say, I don't necessarily have to establish that all wealth disparities, or even most, are caused by intergenerational transfers. If even some of them are, we should address the part of the problem that we can. Intergenerational wealth is the low-hanging fruit. It's something that we should look at, even if it's only 1% of wealth disparities. You could say that, but frankly, it's a little bit of a cop-out. I think most judges will view it that way, and especially because you don't need to. There's tons of evidence out there that establishes that intergenerational accumulation does significantly increase and contribute to overall wealth disparities. So, for example, Philip Coram in 2016 did a study of the impact of inherited wealth on overall wealth in the European Union. By the way, quick tip, nothing in this resolution says it's limited to the United States. I would strongly recommend having something either in your case or in your first line blocks and things like that you're prepared to use that talks about the European Union, that talks about other democracies. Strong idea to make it clear that you're not just debating about the United States. If your opponent's arguments are strictly about the United States, call them out on that. Realize this is not just a U.S.-centered topic, right? But what Coram found is that when you look at different income brackets and you compare people who did get an intergenerational transfer to people who did not, the people who did get it are vastly wealthier. So at the median, like middle income folks who bring in an average salary, the difference is 112,000 euros between those who inherited something and those who didn't. At the 90th percentile, it's 517,000 euros, and at the very top percentiles, it's way over $1 million. Another thing that Coram found was that wealth transfers are likely to get you wealthy faster than a high income. So even if you work hard, get a good degree, become a doctor, a lawyer, whatever, make a high salary, what he finds is you are dramatically more likely to move up the wealth ladder through a wealth transfer than making a higher salary. A higher salary can bump you up, according to Coram. A 1% higher salary can bump you up by 0.1 to 0.6 percentiles in net wealth, whereas a intergenerational transfer can raise your net wealth by 27 percentiles. So that's orders of magnitude bigger. So even if you're playing the game right and working hard, and you're a person who comes from limited means, but you go out and work hard and get a good job, still those intergenerational wealth transfers are going to do a lot more to dictate your overall wealth, right? And there are many other sources. For example, Sawhill and Rodrigue from the Brookings Institute in 2015 point out that an estimated 35 to 45% of wealth is inherited rather than self-made. That's actually kind of a mid-level estimate, but still a third to nearly a half of all wealth being inherited is a huge, huge amount. And there's actually a wide variation in how much experts think inherited wealth accounts for overall wealth. There's a good summary of it in a book called The Economics of Consumption by Jappelli and Pistaferi. And this is section 12.5, which we'll link to. And they basically explained the debate between two sets of economists. Kotlikoff and Summers, on one hand, think that inherited wealth accounts for like 80% of all wealth in the United States, whereas Modigliani, I think I'm saying that name right, thinks it's just 20%. And the basic disagreement that they have is how you should count the interest on the wealth that you inherit, right? So for example, if I inherit $1 million, right, and I invest it, and when I die, that it's worth $3 million, right? How do we count the additional $2 million? Do we count it as inherited wealth? Or because I wouldn't have had it if I hadn't inherited the capital to build it, right? Or do we count it as money that like I made? Modigliani would say that's how you do it. It's you made that additional $2 million. Kotlikoff and Summer would say, no, absolutely not. You wouldn't have had the capital to invest to have it, so it's counted as part of your inherited wealth. You want to be aware of how those arguments about like how much inherited wealth there is, right, work, and you want to be ready to defend the Kotlikoff and Summers view if you want to ratchet up the amount of inherited wealth all the way to 80%. And there's no reason not to try that. Like, try that, and even if you can't win that argument, the backup argument would be look at some of the data from Brookings that talks about how it's up to 45%. But in any event, it's a lot, right? It's a huge amount of wealth in a country like the United States. So then, having made that link between intergenerational wealth and overall wealth disparities, right? What do we do with wealth disparities? How do we show they're bad for democracy? This is the second step in the two-step, right? So there's an interesting paper by someone named Bruce from 2018 that talks about just overall correlations between income inequality, and this is income inequality, not wealth inequality, and support for democratic values. And basically they say that there's an inverse relationship. If you look at surveys of democratic attitudes and you compare them to the Gini, G-I-N-I, which is a measure of inequality in countries, you find an inverse relationship. So the more inequality you have, the less support you have for democratic values, the more support you have for authoritarianism. Caveat on this study, it comes from a high school student, but the data they're using come from, international studies that are fairly reputable. So you might still be willing to use it, provided you're willing to defend that, they did their math right. You maybe not, but it's an interesting thing to read, right? Other specific things you can argue about. One big one is, does the disparity in wealth actually lead to different policy outcomes, right? One argument that the neg would make was, if you've got disparities in wealth, but they don't end up changing the outcome, they don't change the policies, how are they harming democracy? And you can make several arguments to get at this, and I think this is probably going to be a stock part of many affirmative cases, right? Which is, the first one would be, the wealthy do tend to have different views on policy issues than others. This comes from Page, Bartels, and Seawright, where they did, a study of wealthy folks and basically found that they're more likely to want to cut Social Security, healthcare, food stamps, Homeland Security. This is a nice thing to have in your back pocket to show, yes, the wealthy do view policy questions, particularly policy questions that affect the poor, differently than regular folks, right? But more importantly than that, I think the big argument would be, the preferences of the wealthy are much more likely to determine actual policy choices than the preferences of regular folks, right? This comes from Prokop in 2015, and it was in Vox, and it has just some amazing statistics and charts about how much more the preferences of economic elites affect policy outcomes in the United States. And if you look at this chart, which groups most influence policy change, look at that. Average citizens, people like me, maybe people like you, I don't know, maybe you're wealthy. But most folks, the percentage there of the overall impact in the regression analysis is 0.03. In other words, the preferences of average citizens have the 0.03% impact on policy outcomes. The preferences of economic elites have 0.76. 25 times as much. And they have other charts that show this in graphs. You can't use graphs in debate, but you can explain these things, right? Now, the negative might say, well, hold on just a second. Why does it matter if the elites have a lot of influence? Can you show that their preferences are actually worse for non-elites? And there will be arguments on the neg where they say, you've got just as many progressive elites like Tom Steyer and George Soros out there arguing for this stuff, right, making their preferences heard. You should have to show that the actual policies they come up with are worse. Well, going back to the article we talked about earlier, the one from Page and Bartels, you could make that argument. But the other thing you could say is, that doesn't matter, right? We're not debating about whether the preferences of these elites who inherit this wealth are good or bad. We're arguing about whether they are democratic. So even neg, if you could show that these elites control politics and they end up passing policies that they think help the poor, it doesn't matter, because that's not a democratic way to run a government. If X group of people is 25 times as powerful as another group, a tiny, tiny group is 25 times as powerful on policy outcomes, it doesn't matter if at the end of the day, right now, they happen to be picking things that they think help the poor, or even that do help the poor. That's not democracy. The guideline here is democracy, right? This is why I say democracy as a value might be a good idea. It is not, is it good, right? Or is it bad, right? Now, a huge, I think very likely angle here, and one that is very timely right now, given what's going on in the country, I think, is going to be the link between inherited wealth and racial inequality. Racial inequality, I think, is going to be very easy to link to the lack of democratic values. I mean, you can pick your favorite author or whatever on democratic values, but it's going to be very unlikely that you're going to see a lot of negatives push back and say, yeah, no, you can't link racial inequality to a lack of democracy. Democracy can be perfectly fine, even if it is vehemently racially biased. So this is an argument that, in addition to being timely, is also, I think, very strategic. The first thing you're going to have to do is talk about, how inheritances and wealth transfers contribute to the massive disparities we see in wealth among races in the United States. So first, you need to know what those race disparities are. So there's a Brookings 2020 article on this that's very, very informative. It gives you the basic statistics you need to know about race disparities. Like, for example, the average net worth of a white family is $171,000, which is 10 times the average net worth of a black family, which is $17,000, right? And then you can look to other sources that explain why inheritance is such a major part of this disparity, right? right? So the Urban Institute in 2012 talks about how inheritances and wealth transfers are a major, major cause, and they give like quantitative numbers and dollar amounts, which is a nice thing to have. So they talk about how in their study, in a 2-year period, the average Hispanic family is going to receive $2,123 less than the average white family in intergenerational transfers. The average black family, and this is pretty staggering, is going to receive $5,013 less than the average white family. And you say, well, that's just a few $1,000s, but remember, that's in 2 years, right? That's presumably, if those statistics are correct, every 2 years you see that disparity, right? That's the average, right? And if you add that up year after year, and certainly generation after generation, and then if you stack the interest that you would have from saving and investing that money, you begin to see how massive wealth disparities absolutely can result from differences in inheritance, right? But then you have to look even further back and ask, like, where do these differences come from? Why did we have this disparity that their parents had and their grandparents had? And there's a really good article, Brookings cites it, but it's from Hamilton and Darity, which is, I think, back in 2010, and they have this very powerful card that we'll, I think, put up on the screen about why, when you stack the deck against black people in particular, right, in the United States early on in our nation's history with slavery and segregation and all the other things, and violence and the other things we saw, these disparities would continue to echo forever, even if like we could theoretically solve all racism in the present tense in America today. If other people started the race further back and were held back longer in their accumulation of wealth, they're going to be farther and farther and farther behind over time, right? And to understand this, you just have to look at, your own savings account. If you get 5% interest on an account, which you can't get anymore, but if you got 5% interest on an investment account, and your friend got 5% interest on the investment account, but they were able to start 20 years before you, right, with the same amount of money put in, and you were somehow prevented from accumulating wealth for 20 years, then even 20 years later, right, if we made everything equal and you all could start earning interest at the same rate, which by the way is not true, you would still be a tiny fraction of the amount of money that they had. I mean, not like half, but like much, much less. And because these injustices happened before, they continue to echo today, right? And so this is a really good card, and I would encourage you to read it and to understand how historical injustices put African Americans further back at the starting line, held them back from the starting line, and those inequalities continue to echo today. I think it's a powerful argument. If you want to magnify this even further, I think there's a really good argument from Alfred Brophy it's in an article called What Should Inheritance Law Be? Reparations and Intergenerational Wealth Transfers, and it's from 2008. And he talks about this interesting idea, which is that in America and in most countries, most democracies, we have decided that people can inherit, like inheritance and intergenerational transfers of wealth only work one way. They're a one-way ratchet, right? You can inherit the assets that your parents had, but you cannot inherit their debts, right? So if your parents were millionaires, they leave you their money, you keep their millionaires. But if your parents started a business and went bankrupt and owed $1 million, the bank cannot come after you to collect that. When they die, right, it's just gone. Now, what this means for racial inequality is that if your great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather made a bunch of money off of, things that related to either directly from slavery or the exploitation of like African-American sharecroppers or just inequality in general, they can keep passing that money down through the generations. But the debts that they accumulated, and specifically the debt of slavery, right, the amount that would be owed as a moral matter for the labor stolen through slavery, will never be passed down. It cannot be passed down under our legal system or the legal system in any democracy, to my knowledge, right? And that means that that the legacy of slavery ends up being perpetuated through this system, because the debts of like reparations, like, then this gets to the argument of reparations, and it's hard to put a number on that, right? But most experts estimate it would be in the many, many trillions of dollars, can never be passed down. And, you could argue this many different ways, but you could say, until one advocacy might be until the debts of slavery are paid, the system in all countries that benefited from it, not just the United States, but also the UK, until those debts are paid, the current system of intergenerational wealth is undemocratic because it perpetuates the inequalities of slavery. There's a lot of different ways to come at this. It's a very deep topic. point. Obviously, if you run it, you need to be sensitive to the way the country is right now, rightly so, I think, on these issues. But there are a lot of different ways to come at it, and I think you certainly have to be prepared for it, even if it's not what you run. Another angle on this issue is that inherited wealth can lead to physical and social segregation. James Gordon in 2019 has an article about how most inherited wealth comes in the form of houses, right? So if you don't want to talk about billionaires, right, if you want to talk about billionaires running the country politically, you can say that inherited wealth overwhelmingly comes in the form of houses. He talks about how there are trillions of dollars worth of inherited wealth in houses and this is an article about the UK, right? And if you live in a major city in the United States, like the Bay Area or New York City, or really anywhere, but certainly in big cities, houses have appreciated dramatically in value over the course of the last few generations and allow parents, even if they're not rich people, to pass on either a very valuable house, right, or a lot of money to their kids. And what this leads to, the article says, is a sort of two-tiered segregated society of homeowners, right, and non-homeowners, right? You have one group who can expect generation after generation to inherit a house. They might live there, or they might sell it and get the money and buy another house, right, or use it for a down payment. And you have this one sort of group of people who can expect to buy homes and live in these neighborhoods where they buy a house, and then everybody else who can't afford it is relegated to areas where they're renting and living in apartments. And this can lead to physical segregation of people and social segregation of people, not just the haves and have-nots, but literally putting people in different neighborhoods because, you know, as a white person who comes from a middle-class family, they inherited a house or the value of a house, or as an African-American person who came from, whose families were renters, they did not, and it physically keeps them segregated in a way similar to red lines, right? So that's an interesting argument. And then there are many other things we can talk about. There's this article from the Federal Reserve about how wealth transfers already overwhelmingly benefit the already advantaged. The more rich you are, the more likely you are to inherit it, so it just continues to compound the problem of inequality, right? And then there's a nifty little article that we found about how even the founding fathers support limits on the intergenerational accumulation of wealth. This is a nice thing for NSDA, right? At NSDA, we definitely want to think about stuff that would appeal to your sort of general purpose audience, and saying that, you know, founding fathers of the United States, as wealthy as some of them were, thought that intergenerational wealth was a bad idea. That's a nice little gloss to put on what might otherwise be a technical case. So think about that, you know, especially if you're running a really progressive case that's maybe a little bit more critical. If you can come back and say, but it's not just radical, you know, scholars and stuff, you know, founding fathers of the United States thought this was a bad idea too, right? And then lastly, this is an article from Fivison and Sablehouse in 2008 about how if you want to talk about a solution to the problem, how redistributing intergenerational wealth would dramatically reduce wealth inequality. I don't think that running plans, frankly, on this topic is the greatest idea. I think there's a lot of reasons why that is potentially dangerous. You know, even if you can show, right, that reducing income inequality, intergenerational wealth transfer inequality would improve democracy, that's not the same thing as showing they're antithetical, right? Antithetical is a heavier lift, right, than just saying that if we were to reduce it through a wealth tax or reduce it through an inheritance tax, that you know, that would be good. Saying it would be good is not the same thing as showing that it is antithetical. So I'd be very careful about using a plan-based case. Also, because at NSDA, you have some judges who are more traditional and think that plans don't belong in Lincoln Douglas debate, and you just never know when you're going to get one of those. But if you want to show that this can improve the problem, there are arguments along these lines, right? So those are my thoughts on the affirmative. A lot of different directions you can go. It's frankly better than I thought it would be. I thought the app was going to have a huge uphill climb, but I think there are good, solid statistics out there that, and particularly the angle on critical race and things like that, is a good angle to take. So I'm a little bit more optimistic than I was. So now let's move on and talk about the negative. Okay, so on the negative, just like with the app, a lot to cover in a pretty short time, so let's get right to it. Many of these arguments, I think, are a little bit more practical and grounded in sort of mathematics and reality than the app, and that may be an advantage, I think, in arguments before, you know, non-technical judges. So I do still think the negative has a bit of an advantage, so let's look at why. The first point I want to offer on the neg is the idea that most intergenerational accumulation of wealth does not cause massive wealth disparities. This comes from a study by Benton and Keister in 2017. It's on page 6. You can look at in the link that we'll have. And it basically looks at data from a longitudinal study called the Panel Study of Income Dynamics, which has been running since 1968. And it looks at a sample of 11,000 households that got an intergenerational wealth transfer between 1984 and 2013. And it tries to learn about what the characteristics of these actual transfers are. And it has some really useful information, I think, for the negative in particular. The first is that the median size of an intergenerational transfer of wealth was $23,809. That's some nice money. It might help you pay for a year of college or buy an economy car, but it's not life-changing. It doesn't turn people into oligarchs or plutocrats. Remember, that's the average number. It's the median number. It's the number that if you laid them all out end to end is in the middle, which means that half of all intergenerational transfers are less than 23,000, and presumably many of them are a little bit higher, 25, 30, 35, 40, something like that, which means the majority, in fact, probably the large majority, we can't tell from these numbers, of intergenerational transfers are not going to turn you into some kind of plutocrat. They're not going to make you wealthy. What they are going to do is maybe help you put a down payment on a house, maybe allow you to pay for your kids to go to college, part of it, not all of it, right? But it doesn't link to extreme wealth. And what the neg is going to want to argue is that the AF needs to be addressing the totality of intergenerational accumulations of wealth. There's no qualifier that says most or some or extreme or anything like that. So they have to address on the AF the actual transfers that exist. And basically what you do is you use this statistic to show that the real transfers that are happening in the real world are not these extreme transfers. They're overwhelmingly amounts of money that just help middle class folks do a little bit better in life. And so you can basically use it to cut the link to all this stuff about extreme wealth. Those are only a few cases, and the AF should have to debate about intergenerational wealth transfers as a class. At most, the affirmative might be proving that some intergenerational wealth transfers or accumulations are bad or antithetical to democracy, or extreme intergenerational accumulation is bad, but they cannot prove that intergenerational accumulation as a class is bad, because most of it is just this middle class, a few $1,000 level stuff, right? And I think that's pretty good, right? A similar argument is that inherited wealth actually reduces wealth disparities. Now, this is from Ellender, Erickson, and Waldenstrom. It's a study of inherited wealth in Sweden. Again, good to get out of the United States, right, to vary up your statistics. And it says, quote, "Our main results establish what previous studies have pointed to, namely that inheritances decrease the inequality of wealth. The Gini coefficient, Gini coefficient, decreases by 6%, a relatively large effect, which is roughly in line with the wealth compression following the burst of the dot-com bubble in 2000, right? Now, they do qualify it. They do say that while overall inheritance reduces wealth inequality, at the very, very, very extreme, the very rich do tend to get even richer than they were before. But the argument would be that if you are reducing wealth disparities in the middle, right, you're making people who were a little bit on the south side of middle class get up to the middle class or something like that, that actually is more meaningful to them than if Jeff Bezos, I know he's not an heir, but if he somehow inherited another $1 billion, that means a lot less to him in terms of impact than if you are actually compressing inequality in the middle. So you can use this statistic to sort of, at minimum, establish an empirical fight with the AF, and you don't have to concede that, yes, inherited wealth always leads to more inequality. That's an empirical question that you're going to have to fight for the entire round, at minimum, if you want to win it. So this is a good way to not concede that ground and to make them fight for a really important link in their case, whether you end up winning it or not, right? Another argument that I really like is the idea that intergenerational accumulation of wealth actually disperses wealth better than other methods. It disperses wealth as opposed to consolidating it, right? So, any realistic method of reducing intergenerational wealth, whether it's a wealth tax or an inheritance tax or anything like that, is going to give wealthy people an out. It's going to give them a mechanism for still disposing of their income without just turning it over to the government, right? So, for example, they give their money to political groups. There's no wealth tax or inheritance tax that stops the Koch brothers or George Soros from setting up a foundation and giving their money to a political group. So you as the neg need to remember that, the AF needs to be answering improving democracy as opposed to what? If you just assume that these wealthy people are going to throw up their hands and give up all their money in a wealth tax or whatever, you don't know how these things work in the real world. They don't do that. Like, that's not what the Koch brothers would do. That's not what George Soros would do, right? And so the argument is like, what would be better? Like, which world? Because this is the real choice we have, not just imagining that they'll give up their money. Would it be better for them, the Koch brothers? Let's say you don't like the Koch brothers and you don't like their politics, or George Soros or whatever, right? Would it be better for them to, on the one hand, give the money to the Koch Jr., right, to their kids, or Soros Jr., or to put it into a foundation, right? The foundation that is going to, basically carry forward their political beliefs. And the argument from Oxfam 2015, citing Arnott, Robertson, Bernstein, and Wu, this is from back in 2015, is actually that by giving money to their offspring, to their kids, that wealth ends up being dispersed. And it talks about how when rich families pass wealth down through the generations, the wealth tends to flow out and they become much less wealthy and less affluent and less elite over time, right? It is dispersed because they go and buy yachts, they go and buy cars, they go and buy mansions. They don't spend all the money doing whatever political advocacy you don't like. So in the real world, you would rather have the Koch brothers give their money to their kids so they could go out and buy yachts and just spend it on vacations and houses and everything like that, right? And grow the economy and not harm anybody, than what they would do in the alternative, right? And the alternative would be they would go and do what they have done, right? Which is give more money to these foundations and to these political interest groups that share their views, right? So if the AF says we're going to solve for this by having a wealth tax, your response is, if we have a wealth tax, they're just going to give it to people who will more efficiently go and try to skew politics than their kids, who their kids may not even care about politics. We don't know, right? And I think this is a really powerful argument. And I think the Oxfam article about wealth being dispersed over time, let these little rich kids go spend it on unimportant stuff as opposed to putting it back into the political cycle, is actually a pretty strong argument for the neg, right? A fun little squirrel argument from Orrin, Levin, Waldman in 2016 is the idea that in a certain light, income inequality and wealth inequality can actually lead to democratization. And they cite a study from Asimoglu and Robinson, and I couldn't find the original study, but they summarize it. And they basically say that in order for democratization to take place, you actually have to have a certain high level, or it helps to have a certain high level of wealth and income inequality, that you need to meet a certain threshold there. And the squirrely argument would be to say, you have only been considering democracy as it exists in countries that already are democracies, right? But you need to remember that at one point, none of these countries were democracies, and you had to get to democratization. And what this study is telling you is that in the pre-democratic state, right, wealth inequality actually spurred the revolutions that gave us democracy in the first place. Now, it is a little squirrely because presumably one of the reasons why they had a revolution is they wanted to eventually get rid of some of the wealth inequality. But I think it's a squirrely enough thing that if you wanted to throw it in to a larger case, it would be something that you could definitely see the AF tripping up over, and something they might not anticipate, right? Another one that I think takes a little bit of a different turn, to kind of turn the page a little bit, is the idea that wealth inequality doesn't result in worse policies for the poor. One thing that I think negative debaters can ask affirmative debaters is, like, can you show that the influence of these wealthy, billionaires, assuming they're there, and you're going to say they're not, right, because the transfers are $23,000, but even if these people are the majority, and this is the focus we should have on intergenerational accumulation of wealth, are they actually making policies worse for working class people and poor people? And the argument would be that's not the case. There are just as many billionaires like George Soros and Tom Steyer, if you agree with sort of progressive policies, who believe in more progressive stuff that arguably would benefit lower income people, as there are billionaires like the Koch brothers and others who would push in the other direction, right? Now, these aren't necessarily people who got rich due to intergenerational wealth, but like however many people there are who got intergenerational wealth, they're no more likely to favor regressive policies than they are to favor progressive policies. And there's a Cato Institute article from 2019 that looks at the share of wealth held by the top 1% in different countries in the OECD has no correlation with the social spending, right? And it has a chart here that unfortunately you can't use, but maybe you can find a good money quote or a paraphrase. And it basically shows how countries that have more wealth held by the 1% are not likely to spend less on social spending. There's just no evidence that as more wealthy people get a bigger share of the economy, they start really sticking it to the poor. The numbers are just all over the place. There's no data to show that that actually happens, right? And then the Cato Institute also points out that wealth doesn't correlate with any particular views on policies affecting the poor. In other words, billionaires don't necessarily believe in cutting Social Security. They don't necessarily believe in cutting Medicare. They are not, in so many words, stealing our democracy as they are sort of getting out in front of causes that many people believe in. You have just as many progressive billionaires as conservative billionaires, maybe even more. So the idea, their views are all over the spectrum, just like everyday people. So it's not like they're taking democracy away from regular people. They just happen to be using their resources to lead the charge that other people believe in anyway, right? That would be sort of the argument, right? Another good point that's kind of similar to this is empirically, there is just on a broad level no correlation between wealth inequality and democratization. So if we look at it on a broad historical level, there's a nice article from Sheev and Stasavage, I think that's how you say it, in 2017, where they do like a deep historical review of levels of wealth inequality in countries that were democratizing, and they go back to like the 18th century, and they're looking at France and Denmark and Sweden and the United Kingdom, right? And they look at levels of wealth inequality, and what they find is there's just no correlation like whatsoever. There's no correlation between the likelihood of democratization, right, and the level of wealth inequality. The two can coexist, with one another however you like. They just don't correlate to each other, and that's a nice deep sort of historical perspective that I think you can look at and say, look, you just don't have to get rid of wealth inequality to get democracy. You can still have it and move relatively quickly toward it. And then looking today to, this is a paper from Nicoloski, I think is the name, in 2015. He looks at just looking at econometric data on the correlation between democracy. And again, this is income inequality. It's not wealth, so you will have to explain that. But his money quote is, "We find no evidence that democracy is associated with tighter income distribution." In other words, the likelihood and the values of democracy just don't correlate with this empirically. You can have one and you can have the other, right? And that, is, I think, a really important argument that we need to spend some time fleshing out before we wrap up the video, which is, it's just this general theme that I think the negative needs to hammer on, which is that, democracy does not necessarily mean progressive, democracy that benefits the poor and is good for everybody. There is such a thing as a bad democracy or a plutocratic democracy. So there's no inherent contradiction between intergenerational wealth and democracy. You need to break the judge of the idea that democracy means this sort of perfect ideal thing that you see when you read about it in a textbook or you watch Schoolhouse Rock, which is, I know you guys don't know that, but what I watched when I was a kid, right? And you say, it is entirely possible to have democracies like, you would say the United States during segregation. Did it meet the characteristics of democracy? Yes. Was it a bad democracy? Yes. You can have bad democracies. You can have, democracies that don't recognize the equality of all citizens, and yet they're still democracies. So, and you can find different ways to come at this from a philosophical perspective. Like, Wikipedia has a page on criticisms of democracy, and you can pick your favorite scholar that offers these criticisms. One of them is a guy named Robert Michels. Back in 1911, he wrote a book called A Sociological Study on the Oligarchical Tendencies of Modern Democracy. And I wouldn't want to, and we will link to the whole book. I don't think you're going to have time to read the whole thing, but it is summarized by Nadia in 2020 as basically saying this. Michel's main argument, known as the iron law of democracy, or of oligarchy, holds that modern mass democracy is a smokescreen for oligarchy, or as he sometimes writes, aristocracy. This is not about intentional deceit. Michel's was not describing what today's commentators would call facade democracy, where autocrats are keen to keep up democratic appearances even while deliberately and systematically undermining democratic institutions. Rather, the path toward oligarchization, I guess is the word, as described by Michel's, is something that no modern democracy can avoid, regardless of its leaders' personal attitudes toward core democratic value, the principles, right? And so, and it goes on and explains, but it basically says that democracies inherently have oligarchical tendencies. That's what they do. That's what they are. It's baked right into the cake. You can't avoid it. And there is no contradiction between saying something is a democracy on the one hand and saying that it has undue influence by the rich. Is this a cynical view to take? Yes, it is a cynical view to take, but it's important. I think it's a totally viable strategy, because what it allows you to do is the neg, and I think this is very important, is it allows you to come in and you hear an AF and they run a case that says, intergenerational wealth is terrible, it's bad. They spend like 5 of their 6 minutes in their constructive telling you why it's bad, 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 and it leads to undue influence. And it allows you to take that whole thing, group it, and say, I agree, it is bad, but all I'm going to do is show you that that's not incompatible with democracy. Right? Democracy doesn't mean perfect, Judge. It doesn't even necessarily mean good, right? Germany was a democracy before Adolf Hitler came to power, and even briefly afterward. That's what allowed it to happen. And I can give you a dozen other examples of bad democracies in history, and be ready to do that. And you just say, basically, all I have to do to win is show you there's no inherent contradiction between a bad thing happening and being called a democracy. And you win that argument, and you basically get to concede the entirety of the argument about intergenerational wealth, which means they've wasted their entire first affirmative constructive, right? And you just come in and say they're not incompatible. They're perfectly compatible, right? It's, no matter what they run. If they run race, you say, I agree, it's sad, it's tragic, I hate it. I don't like the idea that racism is compatible with democracy, but unless we just want to live in a fantasy world where the AF just gets to say the only democracy is an imaginary perfect democracy, well, that's not fair. That's not a fair debating, and that's not what people mean when they say democracy. So unless we allow them to do that, which basically, rigs the round for the AF, then, my only job is to show you that they're compatible. And I totally agree that what they're saying is terrible, but it's absolutely compatible with democracy. So those are the basic things for the neg. I think there's some strong practical arguments where they can cut a lot of links and things like that. So just really quickly, not to do a new section, final thoughts are, congratulations on making it to nationals. It's a great accomplishment. I hope that debating online doesn't disappoint you too much. I know you were all probably hoping to get out to Albuquerque and do the Breaking Bad tour like I was. But congratulations, it's a great accomplishment. I hope you've had a great year this year. If you're coming back next year, we've got some really cool things that we're going to be announcing for the channel. Some great partnerships. It's a little too soon to talk about, but we're going to be doing some really neat stuff starting in the fall. So we hope to see you back. If not, if you're moving on, always consider giving back to debate. It's a wonderful activity. I know it's probably meant a lot to you. So however you can, judging, coaching, whatever, it's a wonderful thing. So at any rate, best of luck at nationals. See you in the fall if we see you. And we'll close the same way we always do, which is to say, remember, debate is for everybody. So work hard, have fun, and hell stay.